December 1944, Western Europe. A low winter sky presses down on frozen fields and broken hedgerows. Snow dulls sound, but not the thunder. American artillery fires in steady rhythm, shells climbing blindly into the gray. To German observers, it looks familiar, too familiar. From sheltered positions, seasoned German artillery officers watch the bursts. Too high, too scattered, wasteful. In their notebooks and after-action conversations, the judgment is quiet but confident. American gunnery, they believe, lacks refinement. The shells detonate where no one stands. The air remains empty. The infantry survives. This confidence is built on decades of doctrine, on measured calculations, on the belief that accuracy is a matter of discipline and mathematics alone. Then, something changes. A shell bursts above a tree line, precisely above it. Not early, not late. Another detonates over advancing troops. Another directly within a formation. There is no pattern error, no visible adjustments, just consistency. The laughter fades. The officers stop writing. They are watching the sky itself turn hostile, unaware that the shell no longer waits for time or impact, but for proximity. And behind that change lies a story that began long before this winter, in laboratories, doctrines and assumptions that shaped how the war was supposed to be fought. The world before the Fuze. By the time the Second World War erupted in September 1939, artillery was already considered the final authority on the battlefield. Infantry advanced or stalled at its mercy. Aircraft survived or fell depending on its reach. And among all the major powers, no nation trusted artillery doctrine more deeply than Germany. This confidence was inherited directly from the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, German gunnery had been refined under the most brutal laboratory imaginable, the Western Front. Fire plans were calculated with mathematical precision. Barrages were timed down to the minute. Shells were expected to fall where they were ordered, not where chance allowed. By the war's end, German officers believed artillery had become a solved problem, one of tables, training, and discipline. The interwar years only reinforced that belief. Despite the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, German military thinking survived in staff colleges, doctrine manuals, and clandestine training. When rearmament began openly in the 1930s, artillery was rebuilt around principles that had already proven themselves. Precision mattered. Economy of fire mattered. Every shell was expected to earn its cost. Other nations drew different lessons. Britain and France focused heavily on defensive firepower and attrition. The Soviet Union emphasized mass. The United States, isolated and underfunded through much of the interwar period, lagged behind all of them. American artillery doctrine existed, but it lacked the combat testing and institutional confidence found in Europe. When U.S. forces began preparing for war in earnest after 1940, they were forced to learn in a compressed timeline. Nowhere was this disparity more visible than in the air. Anti-aircraft artillery posed a unique problem. Hitting an aircraft required more than accuracy on the ground. It required predicting where a target would be in 3 dimensions at high speed under constantly changing conditions. For decades, the solution had been the same everywhere: timed fuses. A timed fuse was set before firing. Based on the estimated altitude and speed of the target, gunners would calculate how long the shell should fly before detonating. Too short, and the shell burst harmlessly below the aircraft. Too long, and it exploded above or beyond it. Even when calculations were correct, variables like wind, temperature, shell inconsistencies, and human error degraded effectiveness. German anti-aircraft units, particularly the famous 88mm flak batteries, were among the best in the world at managing these variables. Their gunners were highly trained.
Their range-finding equipment was excellent. Their confidence was justified by results. Across Europe, German flak developed a reputation for lethality. The Americans knew this, and they knew their own shortcomings. When U.S. forces entered the war after December 1941, they brought artillery in massive numbers, but not always in a refined form. American doctrine emphasized volume of fire. If precision could not be guaranteed, saturation would compensate. This approach worked against fixed positions and large troop concentrations. It was less effective against aircraft and fast-moving units. Early engagements exposed the problem. In North Africa, American anti-aircraft fire often looked impressive but achieved little. Shells filled the sky, aircraft slipped through. German observers noted the disparity immediately. To them, American gunnery appeared crude, energetic, but inefficient. The same judgment extended to artillery airbursts against infantry. Traditional contact fuses detonated only when shells struck the ground. In muddy fields or forests, much of the explosive force was absorbed by earth or foliage. Timed airbursts were better, but unreliable. A fraction of shells exploded at useful height. The rest were wasted. German officers believed they understood this limitation better than anyone. It was a shared constraint. Everyone used the same physics. Everyone faced the same margins of error. What they did not know was that the Americans were no longer trying to improve the gunner. They were trying to change the shell. Behind the scenes, far from the front lines, the United States had begun to mobilize science at a scale the world had never seen. And among the problems handed to physicists and engineers was one that gunners had accepted for generations: the impossibility of a shell knowing when it was close enough. That assumption was about to be challenged, and when it was, the battlefield would stop behaving according to familiar rules.
The weapon that could think. The idea was simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice. If a shell could sense when it was near its target, it would no longer need to rely on time or impact. It would not matter if the aircraft climbed or dove, if the infantry advanced faster than expected, or if the terrain absorbed the blast. The shell would detonate at the moment of maximum effect. For decades, this idea had existed only as a thought experiment. The technology to make it real simply did not exist. A shell fired from an artillery piece experiences acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity. Anything placed inside it had to survive the launch, function in flight, and make a decision in a fraction of a second. In 1940, as war spread across Europe in the Atlantic, the United States made an unprecedented decision. Science would no longer support the military from the margins. It would be embedded within it. Under the National Defense Research Committee and later the Office of Scientific Research and Development, civilian scientists were mobilized for wartime problems. One of the most critical centers was the radiation laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Despite its name, the lab focused not on nuclear physics, but on radar. Radar had already proven its value in Britain during the Battle of Britain. The Americans saw its potential everywhere, especially in anti-aircraft defense. But radar systems of the time were large, fragile, and power-hungry. Shrinking one to fit inside an artillery shell bordered on absurd. Yet that was exactly what was proposed. The proximity fuse, as it would later be called, relied on a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. The shell would emit a radio signal as it flew. When that signal reflected off a nearby object, an aircraft fuselage, a vehicle, even a dense formation of troops, the returning echo would alter the signal. That change would trigger the detonator. In effect, the shell would be aware of its surroundings. The engineering challenges were immense. Vacuum tubes, the core components of early electronics, were fragile glass devices. They had to be redesigned to survive violent acceleration and extreme heat. Power supplies had to be compact and reliable. The fuse had to function perfectly after months of storage and rough handling. Early tests failed repeatedly. Electronics shattered on firing, signals misfired, fuses detonated prematurely or not at all.
Each failure meant another redesign, another iteration. What made the project viable was not a single breakthrough, but scale. American industry could produce thousands of experimental components, American universities could contribute expertise across disciplines, and crucially, the urgency of war removed peacetime hesitation. By 1942, prototypes began to work reliably. By 1943, the Fuze was ready for limited deployment. But a new fear emerged, one that nearly halted its use entirely. If a proximity fuse fell into enemy hands intact, its secrets could be reverse-engineered. Germany possessed world-class scientists and engineers. If they copied the technology, the advantage would vanish, or worse, be turned against Allied aircraft. As a result, the Fuze was classified at the highest level. Its use was restricted. Early deployments were carefully chosen. Over water, where unexploded shells would sink, in situations where capture was unlikely. The first combat use came not in Europe, but in the Pacific, against Japanese aircraft. There, the Fuze proved devastating. Aircraft that previously slipped through flak screens were suddenly disintegrating mid-air. Kill rates multiplied several times over. The results were undeniable. By late 1944, the Allies faced a new crisis in Europe. German forces pushed back across France, prepared a final major offensive. The Ardennes forest became the staging ground. Weather would ground Allied aircraft. Artillery would decide the outcome. With the risk of capture now outweighed by necessity, the restriction was lifted. Proximity fuses were shipped to Europe in secrecy. Gunners were instructed in their use, but not their design. Even many Allied officers did not fully understand how they worked, only that they were to be trusted. When American artillery opened fire in the winter of 1944, it looked the same as before. The difference was hidden inside the shell, and soon German officers would realize that accuracy was no longer being calculated, it was being sensed.
When the battlefield reacts. For the American gunners, the change was not immediate. There was no announcement, no dramatic briefing. The procedures remained familiar. Guns were laid, elevations set, shells loaded and fired. At first, they thought the results were coincidence. Then, patterns emerged. Units that had struggled to stop infantry advances began reporting sudden collapses in enemy formations. German troops advancing through tree lines were cut down by bursts that seemed to hang perfectly above them. Men who had survived dozens of barrages were killed without ever seeing the shell that ended them. The gunners felt it before they fully understood it. Fire missions ended faster, calls for repeat barrages decreased. Forward observers reported effectiveness in tones of disbelief. The sense of helplessness that had accompanied poorly timed airbursts began to lift. There was also unease. Artillerymen are trained to understand cause and effect. Here, the effect had improved dramatically, but the cause was invisible. The shell was doing something on its own. The sky had become an active participant. On the battlefield, proximity airbursts altered geometry itself. Traditional artillery punished the ground. Proximity fuses punished space. Instead of exploding on impact, shells detonated at optimal height, usually between 20 and 40 feet above the surface. At that altitude, fragmentation spread horizontally, maximizing lethality against exposed infantry. Trenches offered less protection. Foxholes no longer guaranteed survival. German tactics relied heavily on using terrain for cover. Forests, hedgerows, and reverse slopes were meant to shield advancing units from observation and fire. Proximity bursts negated that protection. Shells detonated above trees, showering fragments downward. Units caught mid-movement suffered catastrophic losses. The effect was especially pronounced during counterattacks. Massed infantry, once a viable way to overwhelm American positions during the Ardennes fighting, suddenly became untenable. Units advancing in formation were shredded before reaching engagement range. Artillery no longer prepared the battlefield, it controlled it. Inside the shell, the process was brutally simple and incredibly precise. Once fired, the fuse activated a tiny radio transmitter.
As the shell flew, it emitted a constant signal. When that signal encountered a solid object, part of it reflected back. The closer the object, the stronger the reflection. At a predetermined threshold, the circuit closed. Detonation followed instantly. There was no guesswork, no reliance on preset time. The shell did not care whether the target moved faster or slower than expected. It responded only to distance. To German observers, the bursts appeared impossibly consistent. Adjustments that once took several ranging shots now seemed unnecessary. Shell after shell detonated at the same lethal height. The battlefield began to feel observed, measured in real time. For the first time, artillery was not simply fired into space, it was interacting with it. And as German units tried to understand what they were facing, their own assumptions about American inaccuracy began to collapse under the evidence.
When assumptions fail. For German artillery and infantry officers, the change was deeply unsettling, precisely because it defied explanation. At first, reports described unusually effective airbursts. Then came questions. Why were American shells detonating at the same height over forests and open ground alike? Why did adjustments seem unnecessary? Why did well-executed dispersal drills no longer reduce casualties? After-action reports began to change in tone. Language once confident became cautious. Some units suspected new fire control methods. Others blamed improved observation aircraft, unaware that Allied planes were grounded by weather during much of the fighting. The most troubling realization was that American fire no longer behaved statistically. Random error, long accepted as an unavoidable factor, appeared to be gone. To German officers trained in classical gunnery theory, this was profoundly disorienting. Their calculations told them the Americans should be missing more often than they were, yet the battlefield evidence said otherwise. Something unseen was correcting the shell in flight. American commanders adapted quickly, even without fully understanding the technology. Fire missions that once required careful selection were now employed with confidence. Artillery was used not just to disrupt, but to annihilate. Defensive barrages became more aggressive. Counterattacks were broken before they could form. German command structures struggled to respond. Artillery doctrine, deeply rooted in pre-war assumptions, offered no immediate counter. Adjusting fuse settings no longer mattered. Spreading formations reduced losses only marginally. Movement itself became dangerous. Requests for intelligence clarification rose sharply. Higher headquarters demanded explanations that field units could not provide. By the time German technical analysts began suspecting a new fuse type, it was too late to respond effectively. Leadership lagged behind reality. Beyond casualties and tactics, proximity fuses altered the emotional experience of combat. Artillery had always been feared, but it was also, to some degree, predictable. Soldiers learned to read incoming fire. They trusted earthworks. They waited for the shell to strike before reacting. Now, there was no warning. Shells detonated in midair without impact. There was no whistle followed by a pause, just sudden fragmentation raining down. Veterans reported feeling exposed even while prone, even under cover. Morale eroded rapidly. Units hesitated to advance. Commanders hesitated to order movement. The sky itself felt hostile, indifferent to training, courage, or experience. What had once been mockery turned into something else entirely. Recognition. The Americans were no longer inaccurate. They were precise in a way the Germans had not believed possible. And as winter deepened, the battlefield moved toward a moment where this invisible advantage would decide not just engagements, but the fate of an entire offensive. The moment the sky closed in. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Before dawn, German forces launched their final great offensive in the West. It was a gamble born of desperation and calculation. Bad weather would ground Allied aircraft. Surprise would rupture thin American lines. Speed would carry armored spearheads to the Neuse River before reserves could react. For the first days, the plan seemed to work. Snow and fog swallowed the forest, visibility collapsed. American units, spread thin, fell back under pressure. German infantry moved through the woods and villages with confidence born of experience. Artillery supported the advance in carefully timed patterns, just as Doctrine prescribed. Then, the weather held, and the Americans leaned on the one arm still fully operational: artillery. In the early hours of the offensive, U.S. gun crews fired defensive barrages under conditions that once have blunted their effectiveness: poor visibility, limited observation, rapidly changing targets. Yet the shells did not need perfect information anymore. As German infantry advanced through the forest, proximity-fused shells detonated above the treetops. Fragmentation fell downward, bypassing cover that had protected soldiers since the First World War. Units moving along roads were caught by bursts that hovered at lethal height. Those who sought shelter found none that worked reliably. At key choke points, Bastogne, Elsenborn Ridge, St. Vith, American artillery became the decisive factor. German assaults stalled, not because of machine gun fire or tank resistance, but because formations disintegrated before contact. Reports from U.S. units noted extraordinary results. Kill zones extended far beyond previous expectations. Barrages that would once have disrupted, now annihilated. Fire missions were shortened because there was no need for correction. The Germans felt it immediately. Entire companies were pinned down by shells that seemed to explode with intention. Survivors described barrages that followed them as they moved, not because of adjustment, but because movement itself triggered proximity. At Elsenborn Ridge, German infantry attacks were repelled repeatedly with devastating losses. Artillery using proximity fuses broke assaults before they could close. The ridge held, and with it, the northern shoulder of the offensive. The effect extended beyond infantry. German artillery observers noted that American counter-battery fire appeared faster and more effective. While proximity fuses did not guide shells, their consistent airbursts made suppression immediate. Gun crews were forced to abandon positions under fragmentation that ignored protective earthworks. The climax came not as a single explosion, but as an accumulation. By late December, German casualty rates in key sectors spiked sharply. Advances slowed, timetables collapsed. Units that were supposed to be moving forward were instead digging in or withdrawing. The offensive lost momentum, not because of weather, not because of armor, but because artillery had crossed an invisible threshold from probability to certainty. And as German commanders searched for explanations, another threat was already falling from the sky, driven not by propellers, but by desperation.
When adaptation failed. As December wore on, German command faced a reality it could not ignore. Something had changed the balance of firepower. Intercepted reports and frontline testimony converged on the same conclusion. American artillery was achieving effects that conventional explanations could not justify. Shells were bursting with uniform precision. Infantry losses were disproportionate. Defensive positions failed, even when constructed correctly. German intelligence began to suspect a new type of fuse. The problem was timing. Even if the exact mechanism could be identified, there was no immediate counter. Proximity fuses did not rely on predictable delays. They did not require impact. Electronic jamming was impractical at the tactical level. There was no way to outcalculate a shell that reacted autonomously. Attempts to adapt were fragmented and ineffective. Infantry dispersed further, reducing concentration but slowing movement to a crawl. Assaults were broken into smaller units, sacrificing momentum. Artillery units experimented with suppressive fire against American batteries, but proximity bursts made counter-battery engagements more dangerous than ever. The psychological toll deepened. Soldiers reported the sense that there was no safe moment, no pause between shells. Commanders noted increased hesitation before attacks. The offensive's tempo, already strained, faltered. In the air, the pattern repeated. The German V-1 flying bomb campaign, intended to terrorize British cities, encountered the same invisible adversary. Allied anti-aircraft guns equipped with proximity fuses dramatically increased interception rates. Weapons that had once slipped through defenses were now detonated mid-air with grim consistency. By January 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Ardennes offensive had failed. German forces withdrew, depleted and exhausted. The last reserves committed to the attack were gone. In post-action assessments, German officers acknowledged the role of American artillery with unusual candor. Some noted that it no longer behaved like artillery at all, but like a new category of weapon, one that removed human error from the final moment. For the Americans, the realization came quietly. There was no public announcement, no celebration. Proximity fuses remained classified. Gunners were instructed simply to keep firing. But the battlefield told the story. Where once shells had exploded by chance, they now detonated by decision. The sky had become an active agent of destruction, enforcing distance with lethal precision. And when the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the ground they left behind bore the unmistakable imprint of a turning point that could not be reversed. The war would continue, but it would do so under new assumptions that would shape everything that followed.
Measured in numbers, felt in silence. When the fighting in the Ardennes subsided, the landscape offered its own accounting. Forests were stripped bare. Snow-covered clearings were cratered and torn. Equipment lay abandoned in patterns that told a quiet story of halted movement and shattered formations. The evidence was not just visual, it was numerical. American artillery units reported effectiveness rates that would have seemed implausible only months earlier. Studies conducted in early 1945 showed that proximity-fused shells increased lethality against infantry by several multiples compared to contact or timed fuses. In anti-aircraft roles, kill probabilities rose so sharply that entire doctrines were rewritten in real time. For German forces, the losses were irreplaceable. Infantry casualties during the Ardennes offensive reached levels that the Wehrmacht could no longer absorb. Units withdrawn from the front were often shadows of their former strength. Veteran formations, carefully trained, combat-hardened, had been broken not by maneuver but by exposure. Morale suffered accordingly. German after-action reports increasingly described artillery fire as unavoidable, a subtle but devastating shift in language. Where once doctrine assumed survivability through skill and experience, now there was resignation. Cover no longer guaranteed protection. Timing no longer offered safety. American commanders, by contrast, gained confidence, not just in their artillery, but in the system that supported it. Fire planning became more assertive. Artillery was trusted to hold ground even when infantry lines bent or thinned. In defensive engagements, proximity fuses allowed fewer guns to control larger areas. The psychological effect extended beyond the front lines. German leadership, already strained by material shortages and strategic retreat, now faced a weapon they could neither counter nor replicate in time. Technical assessments confirmed suspicions but offered no solutions. The war was entering its final phase, and adaptation was no longer possible. Proximity fuses did not win the war alone, but they accelerated its end. They removed uncertainty at the moment of detonation, and in doing so, they removed options from those on the receiving end. As Allied forces resumed their advance into Germany, artillery remained constant, silent in intent, relentless in effect. And behind every perfectly timed airburst was a realization shared, quietly, on both sides of the line. The future of warfare had arrived without announcement.
The legacy in war and science. After the Ardennes, the use of proximity fuses expanded rapidly across all Allied theaters. In Europe, infantry and armored assaults were now supported by barrages that could reach into the air above obstacles, destroying or dispersing entrenched enemy positions with unprecedented efficiency. In the Pacific, naval gunfire, once largely limited to shore bombardment, achieved far higher effectiveness against Japanese fortifications and attacking aircraft. The fuse was a quiet revolution, altering both strategy and tactics simultaneously. German post-war analyses confirmed the staggering impact. Intelligence reports noted that proximity fuses had become one of the most decisive factors in halting the Ardennes offensive. Commanders of the Wehrmacht admitted that, had these weapons been employed earlier, they could have neutralized larger formations before they even reached critical positions. Units equipped with conventional artillery faced attrition rates that defied prior experience, making defensive and offensive planning nearly impossible. Beyond immediate military consequences, the fuse left a lasting imprint on military technology. It was the first widespread example of electronics embedded directly into munitions, foreshadowing guided weapons and smart ordnance of the Cold War. The principle of self-activating, autonomous shells reshaped Doctrine. Effectiveness was no longer merely a product of training and coordination, but of systems that could make decisions independently within fractions of a second. The arms race would never be the same. Scientifically, the fuse proved that miniaturized electronics could endure extreme stress and high acceleration, a breakthrough that influenced post-war rocketry, missiles, and eventually space exploration. Engineers and physicists who had worked in secrecy during the war carried forward lessons about durability, reliability, and electromagnetic precision that would shape civilian and military technology for decades. But perhaps most profoundly, the proximity fuse changed the human experience of combat. Soldiers learned that even the sky was no longer neutral. Artillery could no longer be anticipated simply by timing and sound. It now had a form of agency. Morale and psychology became even more critical in planning operations, highlighting a chilling reality. Technology could render centuries of tactical experience obsolete in a single winter. The Ardennes and battles elsewhere where proximity fuses were deployed became case studies in military schools. They illustrated how unseen innovation could upend Doctrine and how a single technological breakthrough could produce cascading effects across an entire campaign. The battlefield had changed forever, and in its wake, both sides acknowledged, silently, reluctantly, and definitively, that war could no longer be fought on human skill alone.
The sky that changed everything. Looking back, the story of proximity fuses is not simply about shells or explosions. It is about assumptions shattered, about what happens when human confidence meets technology beyond expectation. German officers had mocked American inaccuracy for years, grounded in the certainty of doctrine and experience. Yet all their training could not anticipate a weapon that sensed its target before it even landed. The fuse symbolizes a turning point in warfare, the shift from skill-based combat to system-based lethality. Precision was no longer a product of practice or observation. It became a property of engineering itself. For the first time, a shell could decide when to act, and the battlefield responded in kind. There is a quiet lesson here about humility.
Even the most confident armies, the most experienced officers, the most trusted doctrines can be rendered obsolete when innovation enters unnoticed. The psychological impact of this unseen change was as profound as the physical destruction it caused. Soldiers and commanders alike were forced to confront a reality in which the rules they understood no longer applied. And yet, amidst destruction and calculation, there was also human resilience. Gunners, engineers, and commanders adapted, learning to trust new tools, even when understanding lagged behind. Warfare, it seems, has always been a conversation between human courage and human ingenuity. In the end, the proximity fuse reminds us that history often hinges on quiet, invisible shifts, on innovation rather than heroism, on design rather than chance. It is a story of transformation, a winter of fire in which the sky itself became a participant, and a testament to the way unseen science can forever alter the course of war.